Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another webinar from the Newlines Institute. My name is Emily Prey and I'm a senior analyst for special initiatives here at Newlines, and I'm looking forward to moderating this panel today. Today's event is brought to you by Newlines Gender Policy Project and Uyghur Scholars Working Group. As a part of our webinar series, I'm delighted to be speaking with Baroness Helena Kennedy and Grant Shubin to discuss the gender dimensions of the Uyghur genocide. In March, Newlines came out with its groundbreaking Uyghur Genocide Report, which detailed China's breaches of the 1948 Genocide Convention. Over 50 scholars and experts, including our panelist Helena, collaborated on it pro bono and examined publicly available evidence, including firsthand testimonies, Chinese government manuals, and other materials. The conclusion was that China bears state responsibility for genocide. So today we're going to dive deeper into how genocide is a gendered crime and specifically examine genocide being perpetrated against the Uyghurs by the Chinese Communist Party. Joining me today to discuss all this is Baroness Helena Kennedy, QC, one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers and director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She has spent her professional life giving voice to those who have the least power within the system, championing civil liberties, and promoting human rights. She has conducted many prominent cases of terrorism, official secrets, and homicide. She is the founding force behind the establishment of the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford. In 1997, she was elevated to the House of Lords, where she is a Labour peer. She has published 2 books on how the justice system is failing women and has written and broadcasted on many issues over the years. Currently, she is taken on the role of director to the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, where she directs the Institute's work upholding the rule of law and human rights globally. Grant Shubin is the legal director of the Global Justice Center, where he leads GJC's programs on achieving gender equality through the rule of law. His work focuses on bringing feminist legal interpretations to ensure justice for sexual and gender-based violence and access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. His work includes advising governments, diplomats, civil servants, experts, and other stakeholders on the legal and policy compliance with human rights, laws, and norms. His writing has been published in the opinion sections of the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, as well as in Just Security, Miss Magazine, and Women Under Siege. Prior to his time at GJC, he was a staff attorney at a legal services organization offering pro bono representation for low-income members of San Francisco's most marginalized communities. And he graduated from the University of California, Hastings College of Law in May 2013. So thank you both so much for joining me. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I'm so excited to moderate what is sure to be an insightful and important conversation. So each speaker will have 10 minutes for opening remarks, after which we'll open it up for discussion. I'd like to encourage the audience to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen or in the comment section on YouTube. And you can follow us on Twitter to keep up to date on our events at Newlines INST. This is also being recorded and will be available to watch on our YouTube channel afterwards. So without further ado, Helena, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Emily, for a very generous introduction. And it's true that after my life has been as an advocate in the courts in the United Kingdom, and I'm a Queen's Counsel here, which is one of the sort of senior cohort of lawyers. And then I went I became the head of an Oxford college in sort of the last 6 or 7 years before returning to my practice. I mean, I kept some of my work going, but I was essentially dealing with the academic world of law, which gave me an opportunity to really sort of delve into the development and the shortcomings of international law in dealing with crimes against humanity and so on. And in fact, I created an Institute of Human Rights at Oxford whilst I was there, the Bonavera Institute, which now is this sort of leading space in which human rights international matters are dealt with. But when I then returned to practice, I then joined the IBA, the International Bar Association, to head up their Institute of Human Rights. And of course, the IBA is a global organization, and we're very active in looking at what's happening globally. And so we receive constantly, sort of, if you like, people who are concerned about human rights abuses make contact with the Institute. And so for the last couple of years, when I started doing this, I started at the beginning of 2019. Almost immediately, I started receiving things from women, because I've written extensively on women and the law. It's one of the areas in which I have a level of expertise, and I've written about the gendered nature of law, and the not surprising fact that, you know, because law wasn't usually created with many women round the tables or in the courtrooms or in the parliaments, inevitably law has shortcomings when it tries to make the sort of, if you like, the norms and principles apply to women whose lives can at times take rather different shape and form. So I've written extensively, and because of my profile around women's rights, I started receiving communications from women who were Uyghur women who were part of the sort of exiled community of Uyghurs, and the contacts showed me that there was a serious issue around the it's basically the people who are from Eastern Turkestan, which is Xinjiang province in China. And they're people who have their own language. They are people who are belong to the Muslim faith, if they're religious, and most of the people in the area are indeed religious. They have a very distinct culture, and what they were describing to me in the communications I was receiving, and as I say, it was mainly from women in the first instance, or and about what happened, usually in which it's different. You know, when governments go after men, it's almost invariably because they're leading figures, they think, in their communities, and they may be political figures, and they may not like their politics. But here, what women described, and it's often the case, was the ways in which they had experienced this. Women almost always, when terrible things happen, will say to you, first of all, they beheaded my father. You know, if you talk to the Yazidi women, as I have done in refugee camps, women in northern Iraq, they'll say they beheaded my father, they beheaded my brothers, they killed my husband. And then they'll talk about how their homes were destroyed and how their villages were destroyed and so on. It takes a long time to get to the point where they will open up about what has happened to them, and to talk about their personal pain and the experience that they have had as women. And it often involves, you know, the horror of attacks made upon them sexually. The Uyghur women that wrote to me talked, first of all, about what was happening to their people. But when we communicated, and I sometimes would then have connection with them, and indeed I've met a number of them in London who are here living in exile, but many of them are based in Turkey. They're based in, of course, in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And indeed I met a wonderful woman who was living in Washington. She came over for an international conference before we had the pandemic. And what is being described for women is about the way in which they personally have their children torn from them, how their reproductive freedom has been, again, abused, whether by coercion or by real fear. They end up having sterilization, often really because they know that they can't say no. Women who've experienced abortion, women who are given contraception, which often is done by injection, and then have hemorrhaging and bleeding. And in fact, only today I was at the People's Tribunal that's taking place here in London, which is looking at the experience of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province. And it's being led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who's a very distinguished international lawyer who prosecuted Milosevic and so on. And he has been invited to chair this tribunal, which is basically to try and put some form to what we've been hearing, and to do it through testimonies being given in public and a record being made. And and it's being done here in London. And I went today to listen to the first sessions, and the first testimony was given, in fact, by a woman, and she was a woman who was an educated woman who was a teacher in a school. And she had been co-opted by the authorities and was too frightened to say no, to actually go into the camps where there are now over 200, something like 250 detention camps across this whole province. And there are many, I mean, it's thought to be at least 1 million, but it could be as many as 3 million men have been incarcerated there. There's also many men who are in prisons, of course. Again, there are something like 250 prisons across the Xinjiang province. And so, but the camps, which the Chinese admit to having, are re-education camps, is what they say. And her role was to go in there and to be teaching them Mandarin. She has very fluent Mandarin, and she had gone to university and had become a very accomplished teacher in Mandarin, although her first language is the Uyghur language, or a Turkish language. And while she was there, she then started witnessing things which now that she has managed to escape and has come into exile, she is testifying to, because she's felt shame about how she was complicit with them in a way, because she was somebody who was, fulfilling one of the functions, which was to get people to give up their own first language, to start speaking in Mandarin, to no longer observe their religion, to forget about their own music, dance, the ways in which there's cultural expression. And she worked there, first of all, in a male camp, where suddenly people would disappear, people who came to her classes. She gave evidence about the fact that, and was asked, did anybody sort of, once they become accomplished in Mandarin, pass out, that they now were, if these were sort of re-education camps, was there ever a point where they were now deemed to be re-educated? And she said, no, nobody was ever tested. Nobody, it was a process where she had to go into a class, trying to teach them. She told stories about how a young man came to her and said to her, my wife lives in such and such a street above a restaurant there. And he said, that's where our flat is. She was having a baby and I've been taken in here and I don't even know what's happened to her. Can you tell her where I am? She may think I've just left her. And she said she had to freeze and not participate in a conversation with him because she was so fearful for herself. She then was moved to a women's detention centre, where the women gave accounts of having been not only sterilised and, as I've said, pressured into having abortions because of the rules around not wanting the Uyghur to reproduce in any numbers, but also that there were times when they were raped by people in the camps. The women who were in the camps were all between the ages of something like 17, 18 and 40. And she talked about how they would be moved along corridors using a cattle prod, an electrified cattle prod. But sometimes they would go into those cells in which the women were kept, and they would actually penetrate the women vaginally with the electrified cattle prods. And the women, she said, you saw them deteriorating mentally before your eyes, and as well as physically, because of course what was given to them by way of food and so on was appalling. So those descriptions were being given only today as I was hearing this evidence. We also heard from a man who had been detained, but he talked about what had happened to his own family, where the pressure that's put on people is that we will, if you speak out and so on, your family will suffer. And he said, and he did speak out when he got outside and give a testimony to an institute that was taking research. And he said, And now I don't know what's happened to my family, my father, my sister, and my mother. And so the women, of course, particularly, are used for leverage in relation to the men. But the other thing that was described was a young woman who, this was just in today, a young woman who was the sister of a very distinguished scholar. His sister was very clever, had gone to Shanghai University. She was a Uyghur. She then went to work to do a postgraduate work in Japan, and was with an institute in Japan. The way that they got her back, and it was in order to punish her brother, who's a very distinguished exile now, who comments on what's been happening and so on, and who's very much involved with the Uyghur Congress. And she was persuaded by her parents that she had to come home because things were becoming so terrible for them. And she returned basically as because of coercion on her parents and coercion on her. And she was then incarcerated, and she didn't survive. She's dead now. And the story was that she'd taken ill while she was in custody. But of course, the family don't have serious doubts about that. The stories that you're ones hearing are pretty horrifying. And whether it amounts to genocide or whether it's, I take the view that our obligations as nations is to prevent genocides. And we don't have to wait until there are mass graves. You don't have to wait until you go into camps and find burial grounds or whatever. We have a duty to prevent a genocide happening, and that's what we signed up for when the Genocide Convention was created. And so I'm satisfied that bar has been reached from the evidence that I've heard, from the women that I've met. And for me, it's mainly been about the women, because there's something when you look at assaults and the ways in which women are persecuted differently. The boy children of women are taken from them and then sent off to sort of reformatories. It's to deracinate them. It's to make them Chinese rather than Turkestan people, Uyghur people. And so the boys are taken away and made to forget their religion, their culture, their families, and so on. Older girls, I've met like this virtually with a number of women who describe how they were coerced into going to work in other parts. They're disseminated across China. They want to break up families. And so to that sense of community, that sense of who you belong to, that sense of identity is being destroyed. So do I think that there's a gendered aspect to this particular set of serious, grievous crimes? I do, because one of the horrors is when you go after a woman so that she is unable to reproduce, where you're taking the community's viability and going forward away from them, where you're separating people from their children, from the people that they love, their partners, their husbands. You're really destroying the heart of a family. And so for me, this is intentional to include the women in this. The woman who gave evidence this morning at the tribunal described how she was considered to be, if you like, somebody who was of use to the authorities, and she was, but she became suspect, and they put somebody into her home. And this is another thing that they do, is that they'll put somebody to, if you like, lodge with the family. And she described how this man used to sexually harass her, basically. I mean, she says that, she'd be in the kitchen and he would come in and tell her how he liked her food and her cooking. And then he would put his arms around her and squeeze her and hug her and so on. And she couldn't complain because she knew that there would be serious consequences if she did. And she was hoping that there would be some way in which she might be able to get out. She ended up leaving, but her husband was not able to leave. And so she left with her one single child, her daughter. They had only one child, and she and her husband encouraged her to go. but her life was made absolutely wretched by this man stalking her around her own home, and in a way that her husband was made aware of, but it was to diminish him too. It was really for her. I mean, says that she was lucky. She was lucky, and she got out. But she says, you know, even in my own home, I didn't feel safe anymore. So what we're hearing about is real crimes against humanity, discrimination in so many different ways, but also about destroying the mosques, destroying the burial grounds, taking away from people their sense of heritage and history. So I think that what we're talking about is something grievously wrong. And any of us concerned about human rights have to be concerned about what is taking place.
Thank you so much for that thorough context, and especially for highlighting the voices of the women who you've spoken to. The Newlines report that came out in March was also based, a lot of the key testimonies came from women whose families were detained or who had been detained themselves. And so that report wouldn't have been possible without their bravery. So it really is incredible to see all of the survivors, but especially the women coming forward and speaking about the deep trauma that they've endured. So Grant, I would like to give you the floor for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to the Newlines Institute for hosting this incredible series and for inviting me to share some perspectives. And I also want to say what a joy and honor it is to share the panel with Baroness Kennedy. I have very fond memories of our late and mutual friend, Janet Benshoff, singing your praises around the Global Justice Center's office. And I know that she would be thrilled that we're talking about these issues together and today. And I also want to note the importance of having this conversation today, the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Today, human rights and democracy activists all over the region and all over the world are shining a light on decades of impunity for gross human rights abuses in China, which of course couldn't be more relevant to our conversation. But first, as Emily mentioned, I'm Grant Shubin. I'm the legal director of the Global Justice Center, an international human rights organization dedicated to advancing gender equality through the rule of law. And we combine legal analysis with strategic advocacy to ensure equal protection of the law for women and girls. And a major component of our work focuses on accountability for sexual and gender-based violence. And much of this work is focused on bringing a gender perspective to the commission, prevention, and response to mass atrocity crimes. And in the early years of this project, we noticed a critical gap in how basically everybody thinks about genocide. Specifically, we saw how gendered understandings of genocide, from its warning signs to its commission, and eventually to its prosecution, gendered experiences and gender understandings were overwhelmingly left out of the public discourse. And that's exactly the lens through which we look at the atrocities committed against the Uyghurs. For years now, many have called attention to the Chinese government's multifaceted and systematic campaign of identity-based persecution, of mass detentions, of surveillance, of enforced sterilizations, of forced labor, forced assimilation, all the many things that the Baroness just commented on. But a critical and robust gender perspective, beyond reiterating crimes of sexual violence and sterilization, has largely been absent. Gender is prominent in every mass atrocity situation, and it's an essential aspect of understanding the full spectrum of the violence that occurs in mass atrocities, and in understanding the international community's legal duties to respond. And the crimes against the Uyghurs are no exception. The crime of genocide and the legal obligations that attach to it are described in the Genocide Convention. And generally, the convention defines genocide as having three essential elements. Those targeted have to be a part of a protected group. The perpetrators must have committed at least one of 5 listed criminal acts against the group. And the perpetrators must be acting with an intent to destroy that protected group and destroy them either in whole or in part. The convention further imposes on all states that are parties to it international legal obligations to prevent genocide. And it's these last two aspects of the convention that I want to focus on today: gender and the intent to destroy, and gender and the duty to prevent. Genocide is a gendered crime. It's committed, responded to, and prosecuted along sharp gender lines. And the defining element of genocide, the intent to destroy a protected group, must be understood from a gendered perspective. The special intent to destroy a group is what distinguishes genocide from other international crimes. Victims must be targeted not because of their individual identity, but because of their being a member of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And under the Genocide Convention, and this is extremely important and what I want to specifically be commenting on, the intent to destroy includes both the intent to physically destroy or exterminate a group and the intent to biologically destroy or destroy the group's regenerative capacity. However, genocide has been and still is generally understood as a crime committed through mass killings as a mode of physical destruction, the majority of victims of which, both historically and today, tend to be male. And this narrow focus in many ways is unsurprising. With a few notable exceptions, genocide cases have largely focused on physical destruction, which is to say that courts have overwhelmingly merely looked at the numbers of those killed, typically men and boys, and assessed whether or not a genocide occurred. But the understanding of genocide should not be reduced to killings or body counts or the intent to physically destroy. Again, this narrow physical destruction obsession within international genocide discourse overlooks how lethal and non-lethal acts work together in a coordinated strategy aimed at destroying protected groups. It misses why perpetrators choose to target members of a protected group in diverse ways beyond just killing, and how the resulting gender-specific harms are intended to destroy the target community. So, for example, during episodes of genocidal violence, men and older boys are generally targeted as a consequence of the gendered roles they are perceived to inhabit, including as heads of households, as leaders, as religious authorities, protectors, potential combatants, guardians of the group's identity, and as patriots. On the other hand, attacks on women are typically rooted in their roles as mothers, as wives, as daughters, as bearers of future life, as keepers of community and family honor, and as sources of labor within the home. And extending this misogynistic logic to the crimes against the Uyghurs, what emerges is evidence of an intent to biologically destroy. Leaked government documents show that Chinese authorities are obsessed with Uyghur reproduction, and specifically with reducing it. Official measures to control the Uyghur population reportedly aim for nearly no population growth through a combination of sterilization and long-term birth control. Plans are said to include subjecting at least 80% of women of childbearing age to intrusive birth prevention surgeries and punishing birth control violation by assignment to detention camps. There have been countless thousands upon thousands of coerced sterilizations, forced implantations of IUDs, administration of sterilizing drug, forced abortions, and separation of Uyghur men from Uyghur women. The most common reason that Uyghur women are placed in detention camps is a violation of the government-mandated birth limit. Uyghur women have testified to being sterilized without their consent while in detention, and others have testified to being threatened with detention if they refuse sterilization or IUD implantation. And by coercively imposing these birth control procedures on women and by forcibly separating Uyghur couples and Uyghur men from Uyghur women, the Chinese authorities have engineered a massive drop in Uyghur birth rates. And looking at this through the lens of gender genocide, we see evidence of intent to biologically destroy. Put simply, if you want to destroy a group's regenerative capacity, you target those you see as responsible for the group's reproduction. Or in the misogynistic worldview of the Chinese authorities, if you want to restrict Uyghur reproduction, you sterilize cisgender Uyghur women. And honestly, while thinking about how to make this point translate, how to make it stick, I thought of a lot of different ways to try to package it. But it's actually pretty simple. The very fact that these sterilizations are taking place at the scale that they are and with the general persecutory backdrop that they are is evidence of genocidal intent. And I think that my desire to highlight this point, or at least accent it, or put bells and whistles on it, or make sure that it's crystal clear, isn't because it's complicated, but it's because even though it's simple, this type of analysis has nevertheless been excluded from mainstream genocide analysis. Like I mentioned before, much of the discourse on genocide is stuck in a framework that only looks at numbers killed. It only looks at physical destruction. And this is not only gender discriminatory, but it's completely without regard to the law, and it risks leaving out key insights into the manners and modes in which genocide is committed, and therefore it leaves us completely unprepared to prevent genocide. In order to prevent the crime of genocide, we have to first understand what genocide is, including all its gendered aspects and all the gendered exertions of powers that happen in a genocide. And this is as true for the Uyghurs as it is for the Rohingya and the Yazidis and the Tigrayans and the Darfuris and the Tutsis and the Kurds and the Bosniaks and so many others. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant, for that wonderful introduction, incredibly thorough again, and your powerful words on how the crime of genocide is incredibly gendered, and especially in the case of the Uyghurs. As you said, there is an intent to biologically destroy, and we can clearly see this obsession with the coercive birth prevention programs there. So we know that the signatories to the Genocide Convention have an obligation under international law to prevent and punish the crime of genocide at the moment that they know that it's happening. The US was the first country to determine that a genocide was taking place back in January. So what can the US do? Like, so far, there's been some sanctions, but not much substantive action. So what else can the US do to prevent and punish this crime of genocide using a gender responsive lens? And I'll start off with Grant, and then we'll move to Helena.
Sure, thank you for an incredibly challenging and complex question. And in fact, one point of clarification, as you rightly note, states parties to the Genocide Convention have obligations to prevent genocide, but it's not when it's occurring. It's when there's a serious risk of it occurring. So arguably, all 150, I think 148 some states that are states parties to the Genocide Convention should have been taking action to prevent genocide long before, for instance, the US determination, or long before other formal determinations of genocide, and should have, on the timeline, gone way further to when there's been assessment of serious risk of genocide. And I think that is an important aspect on a gender lens through genocide. Typically, warning signs for genocide look at the likelihood of a mass killing episode. And that is true for formal UN frameworks. It's true from some highly respected frameworks coming out of international civil society and NGOs. But like we just talked about, genocide's not always committed through mass killings. And sometimes it is committed through mass killings, but it's also committed through a variety of other sexual and gender-based violence and other gendered attacks. And so in order to meaningfully understand when there's a risk of genocide occurring, in order to meaningfully understand when obligations inure to states parties, you have to understand the gendered forms that genocide takes. And that would include the enforcement of discriminatory and criminal, or at least internationally criminal and persecutory restrictions on births within the Uyghur group. And so I want to mention that one part about it's not only the framework that which we look through genocide is gender discriminatory, but also the prevention of genocide, the risk assessment of genocide, what the international community thinks is telling of an impending genocide is more or less completely drawn from gendered experiences and leaves out lots of different types of ways that genocide is committed and led up to, including sexual and gender-based violence. Briefly, specifically on what the US can do, it's a very, very challenging question, a big point of conversation. And China is a party to the Genocide Convention, but it hasn't accepted ICJ jurisdiction. It's not a party to the International Criminal Court. It's not, and it sits on the UN Security Council. So I think that you have to be looking to non-traditional avenues for enforcement, which would include the UN General Assembly, it can include the UN Human Rights Council. It includes the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which I think there's a real possibility there, but also coordinated sanctions, like you say, more robust, a variety of actions, I think, on enforcing and having a conversation with the business community, making sure they're not sourcing certain products from Uyghur forced labor or from the Xinjiang region. But I think that's enough for me. So thank you, and handing over to Bear.
Emily, what can we do? What should America do? And but not only the United States, but what also should other Western developed democracies? First of all, it's really important that we make a distinction between those who are basically in the commentariat, the comment and the sort of, the people who are leading this country, who run their Congress and so on, as distinct from the Chinese people. Chinese people are wonderful. They're talented, they're creative, they're really good, fine people. And so we mustn't get into that trope where we end up, thinking that this is about the Chinese. It's not about the Chinese, it's about the government in China. And what I would like to see happen is I would like them to be brought into the sort of community of consensus around what is the right way to treat people. And I do think that when it comes to trading and so on, we have to have a better kind of conversation. And so there's a sort of double speak, which is that, of course, people want to trade with China. It's one of the big trading nations in the world. I know that the United States is there's a sort of, who's going to be the superpower in the years to come. Well, as a small nation, but which still has a place at the main table of the Security Council, the UK doesn't figure in that. But we're not going to be. We don't have this sense of we have to be the number one nation on the globe. And so I don't want us to get into a Cold War. I don't want us to be repeating the horrors of, that we went through over the Soviet Union and stuff. I don't want that to happen. But I do want China to be persuaded that a rules-based order has meaning. You see, I believe that actually that the efforts that were made in the period after the Second World War was about saying, let's not go down the road that happened after the First World War, which ended up with a serious depression, which ended up with the rise of Nazism and fascism and all of those things. Let's not do that. Let's try to think of ways in which the world might be better and different. And so I want China to be brought to the table, but I want there to be fierce conversations about our shared humanity and about what all of our responsibilities are in creating a world in which there's less of the bad stuff. And women have been at the receiving end and have an awful lot of bad stuff, which of course does not get into the history books in quite the same way. And so the accounts of women's experience in all of this is exactly as Grant has said, that so often going after those who reproduce, those who are the people who are the sort of keepers of the hearth, has been part of all of this, but their narrative has not been included so often in the stories of previous genocides in our history. So I want to see as, first of all, I do think that we should be saying to China and making it clear, and we as consumers should not be buying the cotton. This wonderful textile is produced in Xinjiang province. And it's one of the great producers of cotton. And many of us probably don't know it, but many of the garments that we wear in the summer are actually coming from this part of China. And of course, they're inexpensive in our stores. We should be thinking about that. We should be putting pressure on those who are in that world, of the clothing world, about where they're sourcing their cotton from. Now, there are different ways. Traditionally, of course, there was a whole business of sanctioning nations, and we're sanctioning Russia over their business with Ukraine. We're sanctioning Iran. And so on. What always happens when you start sanctioning countries, of course, is it's the people, the ordinary people, who suffer the most. And so I'm a big believer now in Magnitsky sanctions, targeted sanctions, where you go after the most powerful, the people who are making these decisions. And many of the most powerful Chinese, folks who are in the leadership, They own properties in Manhattan, properties in Washington, properties in London, and they send their children to our distinguished universities and so forth, and they get themselves visas. I don't know what the situation is in the United States, but if you say you're going to invest in certain things, then you can make sure that you get yourself visas to come to the United Kingdom. And so the way that you sanction people is you target them on the people who are powerful and who have assets in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and you actually have the family sanctions and so on. I have to tell you that Britain did this, and a number of people in the UK have been sanctioned in response. I'm sure it's happened to some of the people who've been very vocal on what's been happening to the Uyghur in the United States too. I just don't know. I haven't kept abreast of that. But I've been sanctioned now by the Chinese government. So I can't visit China or Hong Kong or Macau or any of the places where they're rich, which is their dominion. I don't have a home on the Yangtze where I summer. And so I don't, the consequences will not be so great for me. But I've visited China on many occasions, and I do want us to make the distinction between the Chinese people and the Chinese government, and the folk who really do this nasty stuff. I want us also to recognize that the population in China itself is subject to surveillance of an incredibly invasive kind, because that's what happens with authoritarian regimes. And so they themselves, of course, live in fear of consequences and speaking out and the like. Xi has taken the country in a different trajectory. There was a moment in time certainly in the 90s, where I felt that China was coming in from the cold, and that because it wanted to play in the global market, you started feeling an opening up was taking place. Unfortunately, the arrival of Xi has been retrograde in that regard. But let's be very clear that the better way would be to persuade China to come into this. But the only way you do that isn't by, just having chit-chats around the fireplace. It's by actually saying there will be consequences. And so we have to decide, do we trade with a place that is conducting or is in the course of conducting a genocide? And as Grant has just said, the problem we have is that China does not, we will veto anything in the International Court of Justice. It did not sign up to the International Criminal Court, but then neither did the United States. So individuals can't be brought before the court. And so basically, there is an issue here, which is about the rules-based order, about international law, about standards that have to be set across our world to prevent some of the horrors that are currently taking place in our world from taking place. That has to be an aspiration that is a positive one for our world, to be saying that whatever kind of legal system you have, there is a template against which it should be measured, and that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was a great project, and a great thing that happened after the Second World War. And it was saying, whatever your legal system is, and nobody was saying we all have to have the same system. We can have different systems, but there have to be values introduced into law. And the rule of law is not just the law that a government passes. And that's the thing that people often don't understand about the rule of law. The rule of law is more than just what Congress or a government puts in place. It has to be imbued with values, and the values which were seen as being universal values were created around those tables with Eleanor Roosevelt in the chair. But it was recognizing that whether you were a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Christian or of no religion, it didn't matter. That there are certain things which are about our common humanity. And that's what we have to be protecting here. And we can't be silent. I want to just pose this question. Let's imagine that it was in the 30s, and we knew, and the war didn't happen, that Hitler didn't expand into Poland and places and then get everybody rather shirty about the imperial designs of Hitler. But let's just say he decided that he was going to destroy the Jews. and the gays and the anybody of color, and but let's say that his trajectory was going to be that, and they said that, and in an orchestrated way they created the camps, and they were slowly trying to deal with, exterminate a people. Would we have sat around and said, let's just carry on trading with him? Would we? I like to think that we might not have wanted to do that. And so it's really worth putting the test to ourselves. It concerns me that too often people say, well, our economic interests have to come first. I think that once you abandon the business of our responsibility to protect our common humanity, then I think we're in serious trouble. We ourselves, wherever we are, whether it's in the United States or the United Kingdom or Europe or wherever.
I completely agree. And your comment about Hitler, it just reminds me of the Olympics, which are coming up, the Beijing Olympics, and how we already did that in 1936, and we'll see what happens, what different states decide to do and how they decide to handle it. But it will be very telling to how they view their relationships with China versus their duty under international law. Just quickly, I want to pause for a moment for those of you who have just been tuning in. I'm speaking with Baroness Helena Kennedy and Grant Shubin on gender and the Uyghur genocide. Don't forget to submit your questions. We'll get to those very soon. We have a couple questions already. I quickly just want to ask, we've seen some countries like the US and the UK, and most recently Lithuania, have determined genocide is happening. They've looked at what's happening in Xinjiang, the forced sterilization, separation of children from families, these non-lethal gendered acts that you mentioned, Grant, and have said that they do constitute genocide. But then we have other countries like Italy and Australia and New Zealand who have had their own debates and have come to the conclusion that it does not reach genocide. All of these countries are signatories to the Genocide Convention. So how much of this do you think is countries managing their relationships with China and politics? And how much is it that policymakers and world leaders just truly aren't recognizing these non-lethal and gendered acts as genocidal acts? If you want to start, Grant.
Sure. The question on governmental determination of whether genocide is occurring at the moment, I think is a little bit of a distraction. And I think that and the reason, and I want to be very specific and targeted in the way I say that, because like I highlighted earlier, international obligations to prevent genocide arise when there's a serious risk of genocide. And all member states to the Genocide Convention know that. And they all know, because it's very prominently in an ICJ case, that the duty to prevent genocide means that member states have to do everything within their power to prevent genocide as far as possible. And those obligations are weighted according to your ability to prevent or suppress an ongoing genocide. So, in the context of China, I'm not sure what the diplomatic relations between the Seychelles and China is, or between, a small country and China is compared to the United States. And the international law takes into consideration the United States or the UK or regional countries have a higher duty to meet, to comply with their duty to prevent than smaller countries who have less economic or diplomatic ties with China. But genocide's occurring, it's not occurring. It's very evident that there's a serious risk of genocide, and those obligations exist now, and that all member states, including those that you mentioned that haven't made formal determinations, have obligations now to be acting, to be doing everything within their power to prevent a genocide or to suppress a genocide. And that's the legal standard. And I think that is an important part of the conversation for exactly the reasons that the Baroness was highlighting, that emerging out of the Second World War, there was this shared notion of the importance of the rule of law, of the fundamental demand and requirement of human rights as protected in the Universal Declaration, and of the value and the word is escaping, but of the value of having a diverse and multifarious international community. And action needs to be tied to those values, to that understanding of the rule of law. And I think you're very right that there is some political calculations going on at the moment, but political calculations do not mean that a country is adhering to its international legal obligations. And countries that claim to value human rights and to adhere to the international rule of law, to their obligations under the Genocide Convention, have a lot more to do to put their money where their mouth is.
For Helena, I want to get to a question from the audience, because we've got quite a few coming in and not so much time left. So this is from John Packer. There are many obligations under the Genocide Convention and many acts which no individual can take or be held individually responsible, such as state policies, laws, programs, etc., much less repair. For example, in the case of the Rohingya, the adoption of the 1982 citizenship law was not adopted by an individual and cannot be addressed by or repaired by an individual. So how can these major issues be effectively addressed? And is the focus on individual responsibility perhaps missing the mark, as the Uyghur case and others demonstrates?
I'm assuming that John's question is really about, first of all, acknowledging that there are problems about getting China before a court, because China, as part of the Security Council, will exercise its veto and will basically therefore scupper the chance of going to the International Court of Justice. And of course, has never signed up to the Treaty of Rome. So, but I imagine he's addressing the issue of going after individuals using targeted sanctions may be considered inappropriate. But let me just tell John that in this province, Xinjiang province, there's I can't pronounce his name properly, I'm sure it's but there's a Communist Party senior official who runs the province. And before he ran Xinjiang province, his name is Quingo. And he, before that, he was the senior official running Tibet. And some hellish things were done in Tibet. So he had a practice run of dealing with, if you like, what is seen as a sort of, a kind of resistant group of people, and knowing how to put them down. And so he's been promoted to deal with the Xinjiang province. Now, it's always worth asking the question, why is China doing this? And what China is doing is that it's actually sort of swallowed what is one of the rather unpleasant things that's in the ether at the moment, which is a rather kind of a narrow understanding of national. All of us might be proud of the place that we come from and so on. And I'm a proud Brit. I'm of Scottish and Irish origin, and those things are part of who I am too, and I feel proud of those bits of me too. But the idea of nationalism, which is sort of almost about creating a homogeneous society, seems to have been revisited again by Xi. He's a Han. That's his own sort of ethnic origin. He's a Chinese Han, and he really wants to that sort of unification of the nation, huge nation, to be very much around Han nationalism. And I always think that kind of, not sort of civic nationalism, being proud in the place you live in, which can include Black people, white people, people from different minorities and so on, which enriches but no, the business of denying people's language, denying people their own cultural expression, their ways in which they're different, is something that in the modern world seems, I think it should be deemed retrograde, but it is happening in other places too. Let's be mindful of that. And so we're not here talking about regular patriotism. We're talking about a form of nationalism that should be alarming to people. And he claims that what he's dealing with, and of course it's the currency of the times, is that he's dealing with Islamic terrorism. And that his reason for doing all of this is because he's pulling these Muslims into line. And that has the ear of lots of people, because people have used that excuse ever since 9/11. It became a common currency in repressive places around the world to pick this up and to use it as a way of going after people who, for other reasons, you may not feel belong. And so the rationale is that these people are not like us. They're not conforming. They're dissidents. They want to be independent. And so that there's a reason for wanting to crush them. So it's not just that, this is not just because, it's about conformity, which it makes it much easier to run a massive, basically a huge nation like China. And so the rather than letting a million flowers bloom, it has to be one kind of flower. And so it means that there have to be better conversations when we meet and are involved in diplomacy, because all of our nations are made up of many different kinds of people, and the most successful nations are ones that embrace that difference and recognize the value that is produced by an embrace of difference.
Thank you so much. We'll get to one more question for Grant. We have a question from Daniel Keevy. In connection with the next steps, if the US pushes this matter in the UN, would we likely see China use its veto power, like in the case of Nicaragua at the ICJ? What, if anything, can be done to avoid or forestall this?
Yeah, I think it's very evident that, because of Canada's status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a veto is inevitable on any issues concerning the Uyghur situation. Though the Security Council is not the only body that is able to act for the UN, and China also is on the Human Rights Council. But the Human Rights Council is a body of many other countries that could potentially take action in a way that recognizes the atrocities that are going on. And also the UN General Assembly, which is the broader body of the UN, has an opportunity to engage the International Court of Justice through asking for what are called advisory opinions that are not legally binding. They're not state versus state, but they're extremely authoritative, and they have a good record of compliance. And it is a way to get a statement on the law out there in the international community. And that is something that the US could push for through the General Assembly, is for the GA to put a question to the International Court of Justice on the various international violations of international law that China is responsible for.
I just wanted to say that Grant is absolutely right, that although China almost inevitably will use its veto, there are other things that can be done. And the mechanism that he's just mentioning is one that we're going to pursue, through the Institute of the International Bar Association, in partnership with other big organizations, and maybe Grant, because that organization could be one of them. But the idea is that one would press for some sort of platform to be created about gathering of evidence and so on, and seeking to have some sort of resolution place. Because one of the things, of course, China doesn't want is that they're at the moment saying that this is all untrue. But findings are cumulatively shaming, and a sense of shame is a very important thing to the Chinese culture. So I think that there are still avenues open to us. The other thing that I wanted to say is, though, you can't separate this out from from the Belt and Road policy. China under Xi has been developing a policy which is to actually sort of, if you like, win itself a global presence. It was looking after its own problems at home for a very long time, but now it's stepping into a space which I'm afraid we in the West ceded for too long. We haven't done enough in helping the developing world to develop, and so into that space has gone China, and in many parts of Africa, China has been the nation that has provided the infrastructural support and help and investment, which has allowed many of the African countries to build their airports, to build roads, to build bridges, and so on. And so by doing so, China has got people who are indebted to it. And so that buys you votes in the United Nations. And similarly in China, in Baluchistan, the oil pipeline and so on that goes right down into the Gulf of Horus or whatever, I can't remember what it's called, but it was China that helped to create that oil pipeline and put the infrastructure in there. So we've got to recognize that by stepping back and not doing what we ought to have been doing, wealthy Western countries to help impoverished nations, is that help will come from other places. And so we were very short-sighted, I think. And so I think that the price is being paid in that then you have international bodies, and on that chessboard, China's now got many more pieces than it once had.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there's a reason why no Muslim countries have stood up against China in support of the Uyghurs, and it's the Belt and Road initiatives, it's economic relationships. Thank you so much, both Grant and Helena, for joining me today. This was a wonderful event talking about a really important issue, looking at it through a gendered lens, which is so often missing from these kinds of conversations. So I really appreciate both of you coming on today and highlighting this. If you enjoyed this event, please follow the Newlines Institute on Twitter at NewlinesINST to keep up to date on our future events. And again, this is recorded so you can find it on YouTube. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.